The night they accused me, my fork never even reached my mouth. $75,000 vanished. My mom cried, my brother said I did it. What they didn't know, I had security footage, and I came prepared. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, especially by your own family, this story is for you. My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 33 years old, and I've spent the last decade uncovering fraud, dissecting lies, and tracing money trails that others hoped would stay buried. I work as a forensic financial investigator in Boston. My job is to find the truth, even when no one wants to see it. But nothing in my career prepared me for the kind of emotional math that comes from returning home for the holidays, where the numbers never quite add up, and the love you thought was unconditional starts to feel transactional. I hadn't driven through the pine-lined roads of rural New Hampshire in over a year. As my car crunched up the gravel driveway of my childhood home, I was struck by how little had changed. The porch still creaked when I stepped on it. The wind chimes my mother loved still sang out above the front door. And yet everything felt different. Not just because it was Christmas Eve, but because the woman returning was no longer the child who once lived here. At 33, I had built a life of structure and facts as a forensic financial investigator in Boston. I tracked embezzlers, flagged shell accounts, and testified in fraud cases with cool, analytical precision. My world was spreadsheets and strategy built on logic and undeniable truth. But no amount of training could prepare me for the emotional ambiguity of returning to a family dynamic frozen in time and slowly crumbling. The house smelled of cinnamon pine and roasted ham, but the air was thick with something else, an unspoken tension that pressed at my chest the moment I walked in. Memories buzzed beneath the surface, snowball fights in the front yard, burnt cookies in the oven, my father's deep laugh echoing through the walls. But now there was silence, sharp and stifling. Rachel, my mother. Evelyn greeted me with a tired smile and an embrace that lingered a second too long, as if trying to bridge a year's worth of distance. She looked smaller, her frame thinner than I remembered. Her hair, once a fiery auburn, had dulled to a soft gray. There were faint bruises under her eyes and a shakiness in her voice that wasn't just from age. "You look tired, Mom," I said, gently studying her face more closely than I had in years. "Just the season," she replied with a wave of her hand. "Busy week. Come in, get warm." I stepped inside and removed my coat and boots, setting them carefully by the door as I always had. I moved toward the living room where my older brother David sat slouched on the couch, eyes glued to his phone. He looked up just long enough to nod. "Hey." "Hi," I said, offering a smile that felt too wide for the lack of response. Moments later, Lisa descended the stairs, her steps deliberate. Her blonde hair was freshly styled in soft curls, and she wore a holiday sweater that clung a bit too tightly to be considered festive. Her eyes flicked over me, landing somewhere between indifference and judgment. "Didn't think you'd make it this year," she said, her voice flat. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, though a part of me wished I had. The table was already set, every detail in place. The green and gold tablecloth, the heirloom china, and the ceramic angel centerpiece I had painted with Mom when I was 12. That memory surfaced vividly, one of rare moments of closeness. Yet now it stood guard over a table surrounded by silence and distance. Dinner began with the usual formalities. I helped Mom carry out the dishes, dodging Lisa's sideways glances and David's disinterest. We passed around the food and practiced motions. Mom asked about work, her voice barely above a whisper. I talked about a recent high-profile fraud case, careful to keep the story light, but my words landed without weight. David grunted, uninterested. Lisa scrolled her phone under the table. I glanced at Mom, who gave a weary half-smile as if to say, "Thank you for trying." As the evening wore on, I felt more like an observer than a participant. The jokes between my siblings made no sense to me. Their laughter felt rehearsed, like something performed for an invisible audience. Every time I tried to chime in, my voice seemed to arrive half a beat too late. I noticed the way Lisa subtly touched Mom's arm when she poured more wine. How David was quick to take the remote to adjust the thermostat to stand a little too close. Protective or controlling? I couldn't tell. But something about their attentiveness felt off, less about care, more about ownership. Later, as I stood at the sink scrubbing dishes alone, I caught my reflection in the dark window. A woman who had crafted control from chaos, now surrounded by the very chaos she couldn't solve. My eyes, always sharp and focused in the courtroom, were now filled with questions I didn't know how to ask. "Need help?" Mom appeared beside me holding a dish towel. "I'm okay," I said. Then, more softly, "Is everything all right?" She hesitated. "Just tired. It's been a long year." She didn't elaborate. Her eyes darted toward the living room where David and Lisa laughed over something on his phone. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I wanted to ask about the bruises, the quiet, the way my mother seemed hesitant in her own home. But tonight wasn't the night. For now, I decided I would play my part, the dutiful daughter, the successful sister, even if deep down I knew this wasn't my home anymore. Not really. Christmas Eve wasn't what it used to be, and neither was I. The next day over lunch, things unraveled faster than I ever imagined. We were halfway through roast beef and mashed potatoes, Mom's signature holiday dish, when David abruptly set down his fork. The metallic clang made me jump, jarring against the soft clinking of cutlery and low murmur of holiday music in the background. "We need to talk about the 75 grand, Rachel." My fork froze midair. I stared at him, confusion and dread twisting in my gut. "What are you talking about?" Lisa leaned back, folding her arms. "The $75,000 that disappeared from Mom's account last month, right after you helped her set up her online banking." I turned to Mom, searching her face for any sign that this was a misunderstanding, a bad joke, but she was already dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. You really believe I took your money?" I asked, my voice cracking. Mom couldn't meet my eyes. "That money was for my surgery, Rachel. I need a knee replacement and insurance won't cover all of it. I've been saving for years. I didn't touch your savings," I said louder than I meant to. "You asked me to help set up the app and that's all I did. I never had access beyond showing you how to log in and reset your password." David scoffed. "The withdrawals started 3 days after that. 20,000, then 25, then 30. 3 hits all within a week." Lisa chimed in. "There's no one else who could have done it. Who else even knows how to log in?" "You showed her everything." The blood drained from my face. "You're seriously accusing me?" "After everything?" No one responded. The silence was louder than any accusation. I tried to steady my breathing. "This isn't just insulting, it's absurd. I'm a forensic financial investigator. I spend every day proving fraud. You think I'd risk my career, my license, my entire reputation for what? Stealing from my own mother." "People do stupid things under pressure," David muttered. "I'm not people. I'm your sister." Mom's voice was small. "I just want to understand what happened." "It's a lot of money, Rachel. Everything was going fine until I tried to help," I finished, bitterness rising. "Until I tried to make it easier for you to manage things online. You were the only one touching the account," Lisa said, shrugging. "Just admit it. You can pay it back quietly." "We won't go to the police." My jaw dropped. "You think I'm going to hand over $75,000 for something I didn't do just to make this go away?" David leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Look, if you didn't do it, then prove it. But the timing, the access, it all points to you." My hands were trembling. I could feel every pulse point thudding in my body. This is insane and cruel. You're accusing me without even asking me first. You had a whole trial without me present. David stood. "Then prove your innocence. Otherwise, we're getting a lawyer involved." My mother said nothing. Her silence gutted me more than anything. It was confirmation not just that they suspected me, but that she did too. I pushed back from the table so hard my chair tipped slightly. "I'm not staying here. Not another minute." I turned and walked away from the table, their stares burning into my back. Each step up the stairs felt heavier than the last. In my old room, I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. Then I sank to the floor, surrounded by relics of a childhood that felt like someone else's story. I had built a life around truth, around logic and justice. And now here I was, cast as the villain in my own family's narrative. I wrapped my arms around my knees, the sting of betrayal sharp in my chest. They didn't want answers. They wanted someone to blame. And this Christmas, it was me. I didn't sleep that night. The guest room, the one with the creaky twin bed and faded wallpaper from my teenage years, felt more like a holding cell than a holiday retreat. I lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan, spinning shadows across the wall. My mind cycling through anger, disbelief, and the deep, aching sadness of being accused by the people who were supposed to know me best. By morning, I was done being sad. I was ready to do what I do best: investigate. I dressed in silence, pulled my laptop from my suitcase, and sat cross-legged on the floor. My fingers flew across the keys, accessing secure portals and pulling transaction metadata from a work case I'd been consulting on a string of unauthorized withdrawals across regional bank branches. I wasn't supposed to cross personal matters with my job, but this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. At the kitchen table that morning, I held my phone in my hand like a detonator. My family sat around me. David scrolling his phone smugly, Lisa sipping her coffee like the world was in order, and Mom stirring her tea absently. "I have something to show you," I said, steadying my breath. They looked up. I tapped the screen and the video began to play. Grainy security footage filled the screen. A wide shot of the First National Bank branch. A man in a blue jacket approached the teller. He turned slightly, revealing his profile. "That's David," I said calmly. This was October 15th, 2:13 p.m., the day of the first $30,000 withdrawal. David's jaw tensed. Lisa froze mid-sip. I swiped to the next video. October 18th, same bank. Lisa now standing beside David, nervously glancing around. $25,000 withdrawn. Another swipe. October 22nd, $20,000. Same faces, same setup, no masks, no hesitation. "Just bold in-person theft," I said. "At the same bank Mom's account is held. At times I can verify I was in Boston in meetings." "That footage could be fake," Lisa muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's watermarked, time-stamped, stored on bank-secured servers," I replied. "Tampering would show. This is admissible evidence." David opened his mouth, then closed it. "And just in case the videos weren't enough," I pulled out a folder I'd printed that morning at a local copy shop. "These are the withdrawal slips," I said, spreading them across the table. "Signed with Mom's name." Mom leaned in, squinting at the signatures. "They look right," she whispered. "They look close," I corrected. "But not close enough." I pulled out a handwriting comparison chart I'd sketched. Loop angles, pen pressure, inconsistencies in the baseline, all of which I verified with our forensics team at work. "Someone tried really hard to copy your signature, Mom. But they weren't you." Silence stretched across the room like an aftershock. Mom looked from the papers to David. "Did you really do this?" David's face flushed a deep crimson. "It wasn't supposed to get this far," he muttered. "What does that mean?" I asked, but I already knew. Lisa crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "We didn't steal it. We borrowed it. We were going to pay it back with what more lies." My voice cracked. You accused me. You tried to ruin my career, my life." David slammed his palm on the table. "I had no choice. I'm behind on everything: loans, bills, the house. I've got gambling debts, people who don't wait patiently for repayment. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed." Mom gasped. Lisa looked away. "I've been drowning too," she said, barely audible. "Credit cards maxed, rent late. I didn't know what else to do. David said it would be fast." "You framed me," I whispered, staring at them. David looked down. Lisa said nothing. "I walked in here thinking we were going to eat roast beef and laugh about old Christmases," I said, slowly, my throat tight. "Instead, you turned me into your scapegoat. You counted on me staying quiet. You forgot who I am." Mom reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Rachel, But I pulled away. "You didn't ask for proof. You didn't call me. You just assumed." Her eyes filled with tears. I stood. "You wanted the truth. Here it is. If I hadn't done this for a living, if I didn't have access to these tools, you would have let them bury me." David buried his head in his hands. Lisa stared at the table. "I'm going back to Boston," I said, gathering my files. "You can do whatever you want with this information, but I'll be submitting it to the bank's fraud department. And if you try to shift the blame back on me again, trust me, I have more than enough to protect myself." I didn't wait for a reply. As I walked out into the crisp December air, the morning sun glinting off the frost-covered lawn, I realized something important. I didn't need their apology. I had my truth, and this time that was enough. Boston greeted me with a chill that went straight to the bone, not just from the December wind that cut through my coat, but from the emotional frost I couldn't shake. The lights along my street twinkled with cheer, but I didn't feel festive. I felt hollow. I dropped my overnight bag inside the door of my apartment and stood there in the quiet, listening to the hum of the fridge and the creak of the radiator kicking on. My body was back, but my heart was still stuck in that kitchen in the silence that followed my mother's lack of defense. I curled up on the couch, still in my coat, and let the quiet settle around me. My mind, however, refused to quiet. I thought about all the times I had worked late through law school while David flunked out of his second degree and Lisa dropped yet another major. I remembered the honor roll certificates that went unmentioned at dinner, while David's participation trophies got framed. When I got promoted at my firm, Mom's only comment had been, "Well, just make sure you still have time for family." Being good was never enough. I had to be good and invisible, smart and silent, helpful but never high maintenance. I thought that maybe if I kept proving my worth, they'd eventually see it. I realize now I was chasing validation from people who only knew how to love loudly when someone needed saving, not someone who saved herself. The ringing phone startled me. I almost let it go to voicemail, but the name made me sit up. "Andrea." "Hey," I answered. "Rachel," she breathed. "I'm so sorry. Do you have a minute?" I sat straighter. "Of course. What's going on?" I didn't know what David had planned. "He told me you were acting strange, that you'd been messing with your mom's account." I didn't believe it, not really, but she broke off, breath shaking. "Last night I overheard him talking to Ethan." My stomach dropped. "What about—" "He asked him to tell the police he saw you using Mom's debit card. Said it was just to help clarify things. That it would make the investigation easier." My chest tightened. "He asked his own son to lie to the police. Rachel, Ethan's 15. He didn't even understand what was happening. I only found out because Ethan came to me crying. Said he didn't want to get Aunt Rachel in trouble." I closed my eyes, fury and grief mixing into something bitter. "I'm so sorry," Andrea said again. "I had no idea it had gotten this bad." "David, he's drowning Rachel. I think the gambling's worse than I thought." I rubbed my forehead. And instead of asking for help, he tried to sink me with him. Andrea didn't respond, but she didn't need to. "Thank you for telling me," I said, after a moment. "I'll make sure the authorities know not to take anything Ethan says at face value." "I'm leaving him," she whispered. "Not because of this one thing, but because I can't let Ethan grow up thinking this is normal." I respected her choice, respected the quiet courage in her voice. "You're doing the right thing, for both of you." After we hung up, I sat in stillness again. I thought about Ethan, young, impressionable, already being groomed into thinking that loyalty meant lying, that protecting family meant throwing others under the bus. I thought about how easily I might have grown up thinking that too, if I hadn't carved out an identity through facts, evidence, and the clean logic of financial forensics. But I'd spent so long trying to win a game that had never been fair. My success was a threat, not a celebration. My competence made me a convenient scapegoat because I was the one who could handle it. The one who wouldn't scream, wouldn't fight back, just quietly carry the weight even when it broke my back. I poured a cup of tea and stood by the window watching the traffic lights cycle red to green below. The steam from the mug fogged the glass. For a long time I stood there, letting one truth crystallize above all. It wasn't me. I hadn't failed to love my family well enough. I hadn't misunderstood their hearts. I hadn't been too cold or too distant or too critical. They had never learned how to love someone who didn't need rescuing. And when I stopped shrinking to make them comfortable, I became disposable. But not anymore. The first knock came just as the snow started to fall. It was soft, hesitant. Like whoever stood on the other side wasn't sure if they truly wanted to be there. I hesitated too, unsure if I was ready for another wave of guilt excuses or revisionist history disguised as concern. But I opened the door. Lisa stood there, arms hugging herself, her coat buttoned wrong cheeks pink from the cold. Her mascara had smudged and her mouth opened and closed once before any sound came out. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She sat on the edge of the couch like she didn't trust it not to vanish beneath her. I didn't sit. I waited. "I want to end this," she said finally. "The whole thing. The report, the charges. I just want it all to stop." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean you want me to drop it? I think it would be best for everyone." "For who?" "Lisa." "For Mom," she said quickly. "For the family. I mean, we all made mistakes. You've proven your point." "No," I said flatly. "I haven't." She looked confused. "What do you mean I didn't prove anything for me?" "I didn't need to. I already knew the truth. I proved it for the rest of you because none of you would believe it unless I laid it out like a courtroom presentation." Lisa looked down at her hands. "I panicked. When I realized how deep we were in, I didn't know what to do. David said framing you was the cleanest way out." "Do you hear how that sounds?" "I didn't think it through." "No," I said, sitting down across from her. "You did. You just didn't think I'd fight back." She was quiet for a long moment. "Then I always felt like I was behind you. Like no matter what I did, you'd already done it better. You were always first. Always right. Always Mom's favorite." I shook my head. That's not how it felt from where I was standing. I was the one who had to be strong so she wouldn't worry, the one who fixed everything in silence. She looked up. "So you won't drop it?" "No," I said calmly. "I won't. Because this isn't about just me anymore. You forged Mom's name. You emptied her savings. You tried to make me take the fall." "I didn't make you a failure, Lisa." "That's a path you walked willingly." She stood abruptly, mouth set. "You've changed." "No," I said quietly. "I've just stopped apologizing for not being your scapegoat." She left without another word. The second knock came a few hours later. This time it was David. He didn't wait to be invited in, just brushed past me, stomping snow onto the hardwood floor like he owned the place. "This ends now," he said. "You're tearing Mom apart." "No, David. You did that when you took her money and manipulated her son into lying to the police." His face twisted. "It wasn't like that." "Oh, then how was it?" He ignored the question. "Look, if you just cover the missing amount, give it back quietly. Mom can tell the bank it was all a misunderstanding. They'll stop the investigation." I stared at him, stunned. "You still think this is something I can fix with money?" "She's not well." "You want her dragged into court?" "You should have thought of that before forging her name. I was trying to buy time, to cover some losses." "You were trying to cover your own tracks," I snapped. "Don't you dare frame this as protection." He opened his mouth to argue, but then another voice joined us. "I've heard enough." Mom stood in the hallway, her coat still on, holding a small grocery bag. Her eyes were sharper than I'd seen them in weeks. Mom David started, but she held up her hand. "No more lies. No more schemes." I stood by quietly too long. I thought I was helping by keeping peace, but it just allowed this to fester. David looked shell-shocked. "You believe her over me?" Mom walked past him and placed the grocery bag on the kitchen counter. I saw the bank footage. I read the reports. And I saw how she showed the truth without screaming. That's integrity, something you've forgotten. David turned to me, voice lower now. "So that's it. You'd let us burn for one mistake." "You didn't make a mistake," I said. "You made a choice, 3 times with increasing dollar amounts." Mom looked at him. "I will not cover for you, David. Not again. If the law follows through, so be it." He looked like he'd been slapped. When he left, this time slower, quieter, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Mom turned to me, her face soft now. "Thank you for showing me." I nodded. There were no victory speeches, no hugs, just silence. And for the first time, the kind that brought peace, not shame. I always thought that the hardest part of a betrayal was the moment it happened. But I was wrong. The hardest part is everything that comes after the cleanup. The sorting through of emotional rubble, the logistics of justice, the painful choosing of boundaries over comfort. Filing the fraud report at the bank felt like signing a contract I never wanted to be part of. The branch manager listened quietly as I explained everything: my credentials, the timeline, the surveillance footage, the forged withdrawal slips. Mom sat beside me, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. But her presence spoke louder than words. She wasn't protecting David and Lisa this time. She was choosing clarity over comfort, and that simple act shifted something tectonic between us. The bank initiated a formal inquiry. A day later, the police opened their own case. Within a week, detectives interviewed me, then Mom. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. 3 large withdrawals, 3 forged signatures, 2 very familiar faces on grainy surveillance footage. David and Lisa were served with preliminary charges, bank fraud, identity theft, and attempted deflection of criminal liability. Legal terms for choices they made without hesitation. No more spin, no more secrets. You'd think I'd feel vindicated, triumphant even. But mostly I felt tired. The weight of what had been lost trust, closeness, whatever illusion of family I had clung to, settled heavily on my shoulders. Mom's knee surgery took place a few days later. I offered to cancel my return to Boston, and to my surprise she said yes. Not out of guilt, just yes. I think we both needed that pause, that moment of stillness after a storm. So I stayed. I moved back into my childhood home temporarily, the same place where I'd once memorized multiplication tables, cried over crushes, and planned my escape into adulthood. Now I was back cooking soup, emptying trash bins, helping Mom walk between the couch and the bathroom with her new brace strapped to her leg. And in those quiet evenings, something new began to grow between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. She listened when I talked. She asked questions about my work. She even said once I should have trusted you sooner. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Across town, Ethan had moved in with Andrea, a smart move. Andrea had finally drawn her line in the sand. When I asked how she was doing, she said simply, relieved, like I can finally exhale. Ethan texted me now and then, questions about school, questions about banks and savings, even questions about how to know when someone's manipulating you. I answered everyone, sometimes with long paragraphs, sometimes with just a meme or a thumbs up. And slowly he opened up more, told me he was journaling again, that he wanted to be a person who tells the truth even when it's hard. One afternoon I picked him up from school because Andrea had a shift conflict. He climbed into the car, pulled off his backpack and said, "You're not mad at me, right?" I shook my head. "No, Ethan, I'm not mad. You were in an impossible position. And you told the truth. That takes guts." He smiled, the kind of smile you don't fake. A few weeks later, I stood in a large, echoing conference room at a financial literacy summit in Boston. Rows of seats, mostly filled by financial planners, accountants, counselors. Behind me, a PowerPoint slide flickered with bold, black text, "When family becomes your greatest financial risk." I didn't speak like a victim. I spoke like someone who had learned the cost of silence. I told them about the theft, the forged documents, the betrayal. But I also told them about the years leading up to it, about being the responsible one, the one who was always fine, always strong, always overlooked. I talked about the damage done not by one betrayal, but by a culture of quiet expectation. I saw heads nod. A few people took notes. One woman near the front cried silently. I ended with this. We teach people how to protect their wallets from strangers, but rarely how to protect themselves from the people closest to them. Financial abuse within families often hides under a veil of loyalty, guilt, and duty. But love, real love, doesn't require silence. And boundaries are not betrayals. They're the most honest thing we can offer. Afterward, someone came up to me and whispered, "You just told my story." That night I went home to Mom's house. She was asleep on the recliner, one leg propped up, a book open across her chest. I covered her with a blanket and watched her for a moment. No words passed between us. But the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was just peace. The courthouse felt colder than I expected. Maybe it was the marble floors, or maybe it was just the weight of what was about to happen. David and Lisa sat 2 rows ahead of me, surrounded by their attorneys. Their hands weren't cuffed, not yet, but the weight of consequence hung over them like invisible chains. I sat next to Mom. She hadn't said much that morning, just quietly put on her coat, her nicest scarf, and walked out the door like it was any other Wednesday. But her hands trembled slightly on her cane. The judge entered and called the court to order. No jury, just sentencing. Both had accepted plea deals, avoiding trial in exchange for admitting guilt. David was called first. He stood slowly smoothing his wrinkled jacket. His lawyer did most of the talking about his gambling, the stress of losing control, the pressure of being the provider even when he wasn't. Then David spoke. His voice was subdued, his usual swagger deflated. "I lost my way," he said. "I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I take responsibility." The judge nodded. 18 months in state prison, full restitution, financial counseling, and addiction rehabilitation as conditions of parole. He blinked hard, but he didn't protest, just sat down, jaw clenched. Lisa followed. She looked smaller somehow, like shame had physically shrunk her. Her voice cracked on the first word but steadied as she spoke. I blamed everyone but myself. I thought if I was quiet enough, someone else would clean up my mess, but no one owed me that. I was wrong. 12 months, community service, restitution. They were both ordered to repay the full $75,000 divided between them. The court laid out a payment plan they'd begin after release. I didn't expect either of them to thank me for not asking for harsher penalties. I didn't need thanks. I needed truth. As they were led from the courtroom in handcuffs, David turned slightly just enough for our eyes to meet. For a brief second, I saw something there. Regret, maybe. Or just the knowledge that things would never be the same. Outside, the cold air hit my lungs like a reset button. Ethan was waiting by the courthouse steps with Andrea. He shuffled over awkwardly and looked up at me. I just wanted to say... He hesitated. I'm sorry. For almost lying. For being quiet when I should have spoken up. I reached out and pulled him into a hug. His shoulders were stiff at first, then he leaned into me. You were scared, I said. But you told the truth when it counted. That's what makes you different. He nodded against my shoulder. I don't want to end up like him. You won't? I promised. That night after dropping Mom at home, I checked my mailbox before heading upstairs. 2 letters waited for me. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. David, Lisa. Both letters were handwritten. Both postmarked from the county correctional facility. They were neatly sealed, no signs of damage. Just quiet confessions waiting to be heard. But I didn't read them. Instead, I took them inside, made a cup of tea, and opened my closet. From the top shelf, I pulled down an old wooden box I hadn't touched in years, one I used to keep keepsakes in when I was a teenager. I opened it slowly. Inside were photos from high school, some notes from Dad, my college acceptance letter, and one old Valentine card from Lisa when we were kids. I added the letters to the box. I didn't tear them. I didn't burn them. I just placed them gently in the past where they belonged. Then I took a piece of masking tape and wrote in clear, simple letters, "Family history." Not to erase it, not to hold on to it, just to mark it. My mother stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. Outside, the late winter sun was melting patches of old snow from the garden bed where her tulips would bloom in spring. She hadn't said much all morning, but I could feel something lingering like a pause before a difficult question. Finally, she turned to me. Do you think you'll ever forgive them? It wasn't an accusation, just a soft, open-ended question. But it hit me harder than I expected. I put my coffee down and sat across from her. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe, someday, but not today. She nodded slowly, as if she had prepared herself for that answer. I've been trying, she admitted. Not to excuse it, just to let go of the weight. I watched her for a moment. The woman who once kept every hurt inside now naming it out loud. Maybe that was her version of healing. I get it, Mom, I said. But forgiveness isn't a duty. It's not a requirement to be good. It's a process. And I'm still in it. I expected tension to rise. But she simply nodded again, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, we stopped walking on eggshells around each other. We cooked meals together, argued about silly things, watched game shows. There was no grand transformation, just small acts of grace and effort. One morning, I received a call from the director of the Massachusetts Council for Elder Protection. I'd applied on a whim months ago before everything blew up. We were impressed with your experience and your story, she said. You'd be leading a new pilot program focused on fraud prevention, specifically financial abuse within families. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. On my first day, I stood in front of a small but eager team of counselors, lawyers, and social workers. I introduced myself as Rachel Carter, former forensic investigator, current program director, and most importantly, Survivor of Family Financial Betrayal. I didn't start with stats. I started with truth. Sometimes the person who empties your savings doesn't wear a ski mask. Sometimes they share your last name. Sometimes it's not the money that breaks you, it's the silence they expect you to keep. That afternoon, I received over a dozen private messages from attendees. Some thanked me. Others shared their own stories. One woman simply wrote, "You reminded me I'm not crazy." After work, I picked Ethan up from a debate club meeting. He was wearing a navy hoodie and carrying a folder labeled Mock Trial Notes. He got into the car and sighed. I talked too fast again. My coach said I need to learn when to pause. I smiled. That's the hardest part of any argument, knowing when to breathe. He nodded. Still, I think I did okay. You're doing great. A pause. Then I want to study law someday. I blinked. Yeah, not like corporate law. I want to help people. People who get taken advantage of. Like seniors. Or anyone who doesn't get heard. I didn't cry. But my throat tightened in the best way possible. That's incredible, I said. What made you decide? You. He shrugged like it was obvious. You didn't let them rewrite what happened. You didn't let it define you. That's kind of badass. I laughed. I've been called worse. We rode in silence for a bit. Then he added, also, you didn't hate me, even after everything. I looked over. Ethan? I never hated you. I just wanted you to know you always had a choice. And you chose truth. He smiled, then turned to the window, watching the world rush by. That night I got home, made dinner, and opened my closet. The wooden box with the masking tape label Family History was still there. I didn't open it, just rested my hand on the lid for a moment. They were still in there, David and Lisa. Their words, their apologies, their stories. Maybe I'd read them one day. Maybe not. But I didn't need to burn the past to rise above it. I had a life to build. One that didn't shrink around the damage, one that grew around it. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't about erasing what they'd done. It was about refusing to carry it as mine. And that I could do. One choice at a time. The first snow of Christmas Eve came quiet and deliberate, like even the weather had agreed we needed something softer this year. I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of mulled cider. The scent of cloves and oranges filled the room, blending with rosemary from the roast in the oven. A playlist hummed somewhere in the background, Nat King Cole maybe, familiar, nostalgic. It tugged at something in me. In the living room, Andrea was helping Mom adjust the blanket over her knees while Ethan decorated the tree with an enthusiasm only a teenager on hot chocolate could muster. It wasn't the Christmas I'd imagined growing up. It wasn't the one we used to force with matching pajamas and hollow laughter. But it was honest, and this year honest was enough. Ethan had made handmade ornaments for everyone, paper cutouts with names in bold block letters. Mine read, Rach in gold glitter and too much glue. It made me smile every time I looked at it. Mom laughed more now. She still had days where her knees hurt and her face went quiet when something reminded her of David or Lisa. But she didn't apologize for those silences anymore, and neither did I. We had learned to grieve without self-erasure. After dinner, roast chicken, not turkey, Andrea's stuffing, not Mom's, we played a board game and sipped warm cider. No one mentioned who wasn't there. We didn't need to. Their absence didn't dominate the room like it used to. It just sat quietly in the corner, acknowledged but not invited. Later that night, I made my way upstairs while the others watched an old movie. The kind where the lessons come wrapped in monologues and snowflakes. I stood in front of my bedroom closet and reached for the wooden box on the top shelf, the one that hadn't moved all year. Its surface was smooth under my fingertips, the brass corners slightly dulled with time. Last year I had labeled it Family History, But it had never just been history. It had been weight. Inside were 2 letters still sealed, still waiting, one from David, one from Lisa. They hadn't sent more. I hadn't replied. I peeled off the old label and reached for a fresh piece of tape. With slow, steady handwriting, I wrote family history, not forgotten, not in control. This wasn't about bitterness. It was about boundaries. I hadn't opened their letters because I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. And that was okay. Some stories don't need to be read again to be understood. I sat on the edge of my bed holding that box for a while, thinking of the girl I used to be, the one who thought love was earned through sacrifice. The one who said yes to everything and hoped it would be enough to be seen. She had tried so hard, too hard. She had deserved more. And tonight she was resting. Downstairs I heard Ethan laughing. That open, unguarded kind of laugh that only happens in places where you feel safe. I smiled and stood returning the box to the shelf. When I came back down, Mom was asleep in her chair, her head tilted gently to one side. Andrea and Ethan had moved to the couch, both half watching the movie, half dozing. The fire had dimmed to a quiet glow. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. This wasn't the family I had once fought to fix. This was the family I had chosen to rebuild. Smaller, yes, but stronger, kinder, and rooted in truth, not denial. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I slipped outside. Snow blanketed the lawn, soft and untouched. The cold wrapped around me like memory. I looked up at the sky, gray, hushed, unburdened. I thought about the year behind me, the therapy sessions, the court dates, the moments where guilt knocked uninvited, and I had to remind myself I did not cause their choices. I thought about Ethan finding his voice, about Andrea finding her freedom, about Mom finally choosing truth over silence. And I thought about me, this woman I'd become, not harder, just more whole, more certain of her worth, her voice, her space. I whispered to the wind, not as a wish, but as a statement. They chose betrayal. I chose boundaries. And that's not vengeance, that's love with clarity. The wind didn't answer, but I didn't need it to. Because for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was surviving Christmas. I was living it. So now I want to ask you, what would you have done if your own family turned on you at the dinner table? If the people who raised you believed a lie instead of believing you? Have you ever had to set boundaries with the ones who were supposed to love you the most? If this story reminded you of something from your own life, I hope you know you're not alone. Sometimes choosing yourself is the bravest thing you can do. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, raw, real, and unapologetically human, make sure to subscribe. There's more truth to tell, and I'd love for you to be there when we do.